Coming up, I install some uncommon power adders on the 3800 engine, including an overdrive balancer pulley and an AC compressor bypass pulley. Don't forget to thumbs up, subscribe, hit the notification bell. If you'd like to support the channel, see the description, and I'll answer any questions in the comments. There's a number of ways that you can add power to a 3800 engine. An easiest way is to spin the supercharger faster. Usually that's accomplished by putting a smaller pulley on the supercharger. However, the smallest pulley that you can run is around a 2.7 or 2.8 inch pulley, depending on tolerance. Now you can run a smaller pulley, but you would have to machine down the snout of the supercharger, and that's not something that I would be willing to do. So another option would be to get an overdrive balancer. Now this balancer pulley is a 5% overdrive balancer. Now everybody's engine is different, and not everybody would be able to run just any size of pulley or balancer. You can check out my Everything There Is to Know About a 3800 Engine in the link on your screen or in the description. That explains a little bit of these concepts a little more thoroughly. Boost is somewhat of a measurement of restriction through your engine, and the more compressed the air is in your engine for longer, the hotter it's going to run. You want to lower the amount of boost that's running through your engine by adding some freer flowing upgrades. Once it's flowing really well and the boost has dropped, then you can start adding more boost in. Go down in pulley size, and it's best to be as conservative as possible so that when you're testing you don't run into engine knock. Also, don't forget that there's variation from day to day in outside temperatures. One day might cause you some knock while the other doesn't. You don't want any sort of engine knock for a long period of time. This could very quickly lead to engine failure. My engine has some pretty heavy modifications on it, and I know that I can support the mods that I'm throwing at her. At the moment, when I run my setup on 93 octane, along with the lower temperature spark plugs, the lower temperature thermostat, and the phenolic spacer, 1.65 rockers, and the XPZ camshaft that has some of the highest lift possible, some ported Series 3 heads and intake with a valve job done, and a slightly larger Series 3 valve, extremely free-flowing exhaust with titanium exhaust wrap, a really cold air intake. With this 2.8 inch pulley, I went data logging a couple of times and I was not able to see any knock. I think I even have maybe 14 degrees of timing. I'm also planning on running this thing on E85. That's going to result in a lot cooler combustion too, so I still might be able to get even a smaller pulley on there. So because I don't want to machine down my snout, I'd rather put this overdrive balancer on. This balancer is SFI rated for the NHRA classes. This balancer was designed with an extra rib on the front side and an extra rib on the back side for a total of 8 ribs on the supercharger. The extra ribs allow you to run a thicker belt, which can prevent slipping because this supercharger is a little bit harder to spin with such a small pulley on it. Now when you're handling this balancer, be extremely careful not to bend or touch any of the tangs on the back side, because these are for your crank position sensor to read. If you do damage these, this thing might be irreparable. You will also need some matching pulleys. You're going to need a couple wider idler and tensioner pulleys. ZZP sells a set of these for $85. The idler pulley is steel. The modular pulley system that you can buy from ZZP actually works with this right out of the box. I order my pulleys from Smooth Flow Pulleys. If you do order pulleys from him, make sure that you let him know that you're running one of these overdrive balancers. Smooth Flow also sells machined aluminum style pulleys if you like that for the looks. I shopped around a little bit to find some plastic pulleys because they're a lot lighter weight. And any extra rotating mass you have in your system is lost power. This AC compressor pulley is pretty big and heavy, and it takes quite a bit of power out of your engine just to turn it. And it's not really doing anything for me right now. It's also a lot of added weight. So if I really don't need to run AC, there's really no reason to have this thing in the belt system. Now these AC bypass pulleys are not that expensive, and you can buy them from the link in the description. Now these plastic pulleys are slightly different size than the factory. One of them was a 3.5 inch from the factory. The other one was a 3 inch. I'm actually going to replace both of these with 3 inches. They're the smooth style. These are actually the same exact sizes that's in the ZZP kit. Gates has a pretty good online catalog that you can filter through and find different sizes of pulleys, and then go find them at O'Reilly's. Or alternatively, you can still use the Gates pulley part number, plug that into Rock Auto, and then find vehicles that that's compatible with. Look up that vehicle, and then find other brands of the same size pulley. Now you will need to find a custom length belt that's 8 ribs for your application. First, you should definitely get a piece of paper and scratch down the belt routing that's on your engine. So first, you're going to find your supercharger tensioner. You're going to put a wrench on it, turn it to the left to loosen it up, and then pull the belt off. Mine happens to be a 15. It's a good idea to make sure that these tensioners are nice and springy still, and if they're not, go ahead and replace them. And then do the same thing for the accessory belt. I use the hillbilly wrench technique here. Now would be a good time to inspect these belts, see if there's any excessive wear or cracking, and if there is, then go ahead and replace them. First, I'm going to chock the wheels on the opposite end of the car, both on the front and the back. I'm going to jack the car up on the engine cradle and then put a jack stand underneath, and then lower it onto the jack stand. Then I'm going to take the wheel off to get access to the balancer pulley. There may be some fender wells to remove in your car. I'm going to be removing my crankshaft balancer bolt with my impact driver. You can get away with a 15/16 or a 24mm socket. Now, if you don't have an impact driver, it's a good idea to get one, but I have heard of people putting a breaker bar on the balancer bolt and then pinning it against the ground and then cranking the car to break it loose. I'm not going to recommend you do that. Last time I did this, I coated my bolts in some anti-seize and it came out really nice. You can rent a balancer removal tool and a balancer install tool from your local auto parts store, or you can see the link in the description if you want to order one. I actually had to rent two of these kits, the big one from Advance and the small one from either O'Reilly's or AutoZone. I need these bolts, which are 6x1, to pull the existing balancer off, and I need this short pin here. So first thread this thing into the shaft. Now if your web is actually not symmetrical on either side, you want to put the point on the web facing towards the balancer, and you always want the flat face facing towards you. Be sure to oil up the threads first. Then we're going to slide the small pin in here into this locating hole. Then we're going to line this up with the hole, clock it so that I can get the other screws in and start threading the other screws in. Make sure that you bottom out these screws. Don't tighten them too tight. You don't want to strip them out or anything. I would do this part by hand so that you can tell what's going on and get a feel for it. It's a pretty steady force on the wrench until right at the last moment where it lets go. Now I can tell it's pretty loose, so it's time to take it back off. This is a 3/4 inch ratchet that I'm using here. Now I'm going to take the center pin back out and pull this whole thing off. Inside of this thing, there is a point that this pin centers on so that you can pull this thing off evenly. You don't want to scratch up the crankshaft when it comes out. If you ever plan on reusing this balancer, be sure not to drop it so you don't damage the tangs on the back. Here is your crank position sensor. Be very careful not to damage this or touch it at all. The tangs on the back of the balancer actually move through here and the sensor picks them up. Also, be sure to inspect the keyway and make sure the key is not damaged. If it is, replace it. Also, make sure that your crankshaft doesn't have any burrs or nicks. The instructions do say to file down the sharp edge on the end of the crankshaft. And examining this crankshaft does reveal that there is a little bit of a sharp edge on the end, so I'll file this down. Let's wipe this thing off with a little bit of brake cleaner. The instructions indicate the crankshaft diameter should be between 1/1000th and 14/10,000ths larger than the inner bore diameter of the balancer in order for a proper interference fit. This crankshaft diameter is right at 1.375 inches. What I'll do is I'll take the average of 3 measurements on each the crankshaft and the inner bore diameter, and with the final results I'll subtract the inner bore diameter from the crankshaft diameter. This caliper really isn't the right tool, but it's all I've got. Looks like it's right on the borderline. The error in my measurement probably makes up for the difference, but since it's on the low end, I am not going to hone this thing out. Now is a great time to inspect your oil seal. Go ahead and take a look for any tears, see if there's any leaks or any oil present around here. I think I might replace this just because I'm in here. Just take a medium-sized pry bar and pin it against the shaft and the inside of this little lip and just pry it out. This one popped right out. That was easy. Alternatively, you might be able to thread some screws into this thing and pull it out with some pliers, or you can get a slide hammer with a seal puller attachment. Also, make sure that this oil return hole right here is not clogged up. If you do mess up the surface here, if you have to hammer it out with a screwdriver, be sure to file it flat again and then clean it off. I'm just going to wipe this area out, clean it off a little. Be sure to use a lint-free cloth. I am going to remove this cover here. It's actually pretty in the way of hammering this new seal back in. You'll have to remove the connector first. This thing really just pulls right off. So this new seal has RTV all the way around. It's not necessary to lube it up or put any more on. What we're going to do is just stick it in the hole, get something flat, and just hammer it into place slowly. My 3.4 inch pulley happens to be the exact size of this thing, so I'm going to use that to hammer against. This is a little bit harder than it looks. Be careful not to get any debris in here. Make sure that there's no gaps between this and the front plate once you're done sealing it in. Unfortunately, if you have a Grand Prix GTP, the oil filter bracket is actually too close to the balancer in order to install this new one. ZZP sells a spacer bracket. You will also need a new gasket for this. So since that bracket's got to come off, I'm going to first start by draining the oil. I like to use these magnetic drain plugs. Picks up any metal floating around in your oil. I also put a neodymium magnet on the oil pan just in case there's anything else in there. I take it off when I drain the oil. My oil pan bolt is a 15 millimeter. Not really ideal to let the oil drain out with the car jacked up because you could leave some in the oil pan. Then let's remove the oil filter. Careful because this thing will leak out oil. Then replace the oil drain plug. Torque the oil pan drain plug to 22 foot-pounds. First, disconnect the wire to the oil sender. If you have a Fiero Raj engine bracket like me, with the 88 oil sender, then this is extremely tight here, and the connector is actually pinned against the alternator bracket. And you've got to pull on the oil pressure sensor a little bit in order to yank it out. Then you've got to take off the 4 13 millimeter bolts. I'm using an extension and a swivel here. And for this last one, I've got to use a box wrench for it. Then just smack it and it should come off. Some oil came out of this, so I'm glad I had my oil pan underneath it. This part here is the bypass valve and the spring. I'm going to take this out so I can clean off this surface. I like to use these plastic razor blades, and it won't mar up metal surfaces that you're worried about keeping smooth. I'm getting nowhere fast with this stuff, so I decided to let it soak in acetone. It's been about a day and a half, and it's time to resume cleaning off. I'll apply a little bit of pipe thread compound to the oil pressure sender, and we're going to reinstall it with a 1 1/16 inch wrench. Torque the oil pressure switch to 12 foot-pounds. To save us some hassle, I'm going to clock it this direction, so that's easier to get at next time with the Fiero Raj bracket. Well, now's the fun part. We get to clean off the surface of the oil filter bracket on the engine side. Now these surfaces are all aluminum, so you don't want to use a steel razor blade because you could scratch the surface. Here I'm using a rag soaked in brake cleaner just to kind of hold against this thing to try to loosen this up. That didn't seem to work too quick, so I tried doing the same thing with some Goo Gone. I probably let it sit for 45 minutes and that didn't work too good either. Now I'm going to try some more serious stripper. This is for removing epoxy and paint. Try not to get any leftover gasket material in any of these oiling holes here, and if you do, be sure to clean it all out really good. Finally, this stuff looks like it did the trick. Then use your plastic razor blade and clean up the rest. Now I'm going to take the other wheel off and lower the back of the car as low as I can go to try to get any extra fluid out of here to drain out when I've cleaned this off. And last, I'm going to get the shop vac out and make sure that I've got all of the debris out. I like to put an undersized hose into my shop vac and just hold it in place using my hand as a seal. That way I can get this smaller hose into any crevice and crack. Now I'm going to prime this crankshaft area and the pump behind the seal in order to make sure that everything is properly oiled on startup. I'm also going to prime some of the holes where the oil filter housing goes. So I'm going to prime everything until oil runs out. Make sure the face of this is still clean and dry. You might want to spray a cloth with some brake clean and then dab it off. Be sure not to wipe because you don't want to catch the rag on a sharp edge and then rip some off and have it floating around your engine. Do not forget to reinstall the oil bypass valve. If you do, then you'll blow up your engine very quickly. These bolts that came out appear to have thread sealant on them, so I'm going to reapply some thread sealant on these. Use the bypass valve as a guide pin to put the gasket on initially. First I'm going to put the gasket on the housing, then the plate on, and the 2 top bolts through it. Then install the new oil filter housing. Put the 4 bolts in, torque the bolts to 11 foot-pounds plus 50 degrees. There's no way that I can actually get a torque wrench in here to torque these, so I'm just going to do my best. It is a little bit tricky to get the bolt started because of the spring-loaded bypass valve. Then don't forget to plug the oil sender back in, then pop the shield back on, and then plug in the crank position sensor. This overdrive balancer is just over 12 pounds, and that my OEM one came in right at 9 pounds. So I'm going to look to see where else I can save some weight. The extra weight actually helps with the dampening. It's important to dampen these engines if you modify them to go above the original RPM. There's also 2 different keyway holes on this new balancer. Be sure to use the smaller one. Then we're going to oil up the outer shaft of the balancer with some engine oil, and we're going to oil up the seal too. This will help with installation, make sure that we don't tear the seal up. Then get some anti-seize lubricant out and lubricate the inside bore of the balancer and lubricate the crankshaft. Make sure not to get this on the oil seal. This is required when you're pressing on the balancer pulley. To drive on the balancer, all I'm going to use is this thrust bearing here and the original bolt. The nut that's intended to be used with this thrust bearing is the same style material with low friction. So because this thing has a coating on it, I'm actually going to oil it up a little bit with some more engine oil. just to make sure that everything slides smoothly. Now line it up on the shaft and make sure that the small key weight on the balancer is going into the key on the crankshaft. Again, be careful not to bend the tangs. You can know the keyway is engaged if you can't move it back and forth at all. Thrust washer actually can't fit on here because this bolt is not long enough. So I'm just going to tighten it up until there's enough space in here for the thrust washer to fit. This thing should be pretty easy to turn by hand. Make sure that you do that the majority of the way. It should not be tough. If it is, then something might be wrong. You should probably back it off and think about honing out the inner bore a little bit more. Make sure the thrust bearing is centered nice and good. Then just tighten it on until it bottoms out. It's bottomed out when it starts turning. Now take this thrust bearing off in the bolt and get your brand new crankshaft bolt. These crankshaft balancer bolts actually torque to yield, meaning that they permanently deform. So it is important to throw these things away after you're done using them. Then anti-seize the threads of the new bolt. Clean off this oily surface now. Tighten it all the way down until it starts spinning again. Then I put an 11/16 and a 17mm socket into these balance holes and wedged a pry bar between them and then wedged it against the frame in order to torque against this thing, to be able to torque it to spec. Torque the crankshaft balancer bolt to 111 foot-pounds plus 76 degrees. So that's where my torque wrench snapped. Now I'm going to do an additional 76 degrees. That's somewhere between 45 and 90. Take the sockets out. Then fill up your oil filter with some clean oil. Lubricate the seal, thread it back on. Pour some fresh oil into your engine. You need about 4.5 quarts for this engine. Now let's take some weight out of the system by installing some lighter weight pulleys. To get your AC compressor bypass pulley installed, first we're going to vent your AC system. Have a professional do this or refer to a video linked in the description. Once your AC system is vented, then you can remove the AC hose. It might be wise to get the intake out of the way if you can. Now my hoses are custom, so yours is going to look totally different. First I'm going to disconnect the pressure switch. Make sure to zip tie this wire around the harness somewhere that'll be safe. There's just one 10mm nut to take off on this side. Hook your intake back up. Then there's a 15mm nut holding the AC hose onto the compressor. Then the AC hose should just pull out and you should be able to remove the whole thing. Then disconnect the AC clutch signal and go ahead and zip tie this somewhere safe as well. Remove the bolt on the side of the engine block, keeping the bracket on, and then the two top bolts on the top of the compressor. Then loosen up the third bolt on the bottom of the front of the compressor and then hinge it down, take it out all the way, and then remove the compressor. There are a few different styles of these brackets, but I use the GTP one because it's the lightest weight and smallest. This one is from Bonneville. This bypass pulley also comes with several fasteners and adapters, probably for a different application because I don't think I need these. Simply just tighten these three 15mm bolts back on. Remove all three other supercharger pulleys in the system. Two are 15mm bolts and one is a T50 Torx bit. Keep track of where the screws came from because they're all different. You really cannot find a plastic 8-rib grooved pulley that's the same as this, so this lightweight aluminum one will have to do. Otherwise, you'd have to go with the factory steel or something. This is the factory steel 6-rib pulley compared to the smooth flow machined aluminum idler pulley. Here's the 3 OEM pulleys, 2 plastic and 1 steel. Here's the weight of all aluminum pulleys. With my combination of both plastic and aluminum, I'm actually saving about 120 grams over the OEM setup. This is not including the removal of the steel air compressor pulley and replacing it with the plastic AC bypass pulley. Here's the factory supercharger 3.8-inch pulley versus my machined aluminum smooth flow 2.8-inch pulley. And then reinstall the new pulleys. Turns out that because this belt system wasn't really made for 8 ribs, I have a little bit of interference on one of my tensioners. I'm going to just grind this little nub off. This is a 13. Nice. Don't over tighten these and make sure they still spin after you're done. Now I'm going to remove the blower pulley and install my 2.7 just to see for fitment. Since this is smooth flow, I'm going to use a 1/8 inch hex head. I'm probably going to go back down to my 3.4 inch 6-rib pulley for a while. You can still run a 6-rib belt on an 8-rib system, but you might want to check to see if it jumps grooves every once in a while. ZZP does not guarantee that their 2.7 pulleys can clear every supercharger. Now keep in mind, we're not changing anything on the accessory belt. We're going to keep the same exact belt here. Grab your old belt, put it on best you can, and then estimate based on that how much extra length or how much less length you need. They usually sell belts in about 1/2 inch increments. Start your car up and make sure that you have oil pressure. If not, shut it off immediately. Check for oil leaks. Make sure you check for fitment and ensure that it's not rubbing. Make sure your belt doesn't slip off and it's not too squeaky. You might have to do a crankshaft position learn sequence on your engine now. You might want to take this into a shop to have done. That's all for this video. If you liked it, please thumbs up, subscribe, hit the notification bell. You can support this channel in the description. All the parts that I use are there too, and I'll answer any questions in the comments.